God doesn't intend to dwell in a broken body. Grace and peace, everybody. This is part number 5, last part of this 5-part series, as we look at the promise of the unified body of Christ. Ephesians chapter 4 is a great book. It's a great book for any relationship, any context where believers are trying to find themselves to be together. And so that's why I'm grateful for these promises, grateful for these verses. And as we wrap it up, we see God's idea again, where he wants to dwell in us, right? That's the gift and the promise of his Spirit. But he can, and he does not want to dwell in a broken body. And it works the same way in the spiritual sense when you think about the body of Christ, the church, the family of God that we are, whether it's at church or whether it's at home. When it's broken, that breath was not intended to dwell in that kind of situation. Because when you read verses like Ephesians chapter 4 and verse number 4, it says, look, just like we saw there's one Lord in verse 5, and just like we saw there's one God in verse 6, here now it says there's one body. There is one body and one Spirit, even as you're called in one hope of your calling. So if you will, if there's one body, there's one Spirit for that one body. And anytime we find ourselves operating in a different spirit, well, that's a different body. That's a broken body. Or anytime that body is divided, the Lord can only come in a certain measure, but he can't come in the full measure, right? We looked at what happened with the disciples, but when they made that transition to apostles, the big part of that transition was they put all their focus on one person. Who was that? Christ. When they saw him on the cross, when they recognized that he died for them, that he was risen again, they laid everything aside, and it was that focus on him that paved the way now. In Acts chapter 1 is what paves the way for Acts chapter 2. And that was now, the Lord's like, now I can breathe in them in the full measure, because he's not thinking this way and she's not thinking that way. They're not thinking this way. They're not on this side of the issue. They found a focus. And once they found that focus, every time you see that happening in the Bible, whether it was Israel, whether it was in the New Testament and Acts, and even today, that's what God said he would do. Because there's one body and there's one Spirit. But that one Spirit can only work in a one body. In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 11, again, now we're talking about these different gifts. And here are some of the gifts that God has given, these spiritual gifts. He gave some apostles, and he gave some prophets, and some evangelists, and some pastors, and some teachers. He's given all these gifts. Remember, there's one Spirit that is now revealing God's power through pastors, through teachers, through apostles, and these are just some of the gifts that are mentioned here in this particular chapter. And as all these gifts, right, and all these packages, right, are being given and gifted from the church to the world, they all came from one store, though. One store. And you see that in verse number 12, because it says, for the perfecting of the saints, for the work of the ministry, and for the edifying of the body of Christ. This is God's ideal. Ephesians 4 just lays it down so plainly to where you see all these gifts, right, being shared and being given amongst the body, but they all come from one source. But that one source, which is the Spirit of God, it works in one body, the body of Christ. It did not say the bodies of Christ. One body. And so if this is God's expectation, what if we matched ours to his? What if we, rather than trying to get him to fill our cup and to pour according to our standard, what if we took our cup to the well? What if everybody brought their cups to one well and we all drank? What difference would that make? What power would that show? And what could we see happen differently that we may be well intended on happening, but because we're at different cups and we're at different wells, it's impossible for us to drink together. Let's go back to the well. Let's go back to the source. Let's look at what Ephesians has given to us and recognize we can't do this on our own. Confess that, yeah, what we've done, yeah, we've made a mess on some level, whether it was in our house, whether it's in the holy place, whether it's in church or in school, whatever. We make the mess, but thank God we got a Messiah We have somebody who's in the business of fixing what we've broken. And if we make him our focus, God has promised that no sooner than we do that, he will fill us with his power. That's when we have the latter rain. When everyone who's made the decision to let Christ fill their cup, the Spirit of God will move and this work will be done. And if it's done in the earth, that means it'll be done in our homes. And if it's done in our homes, that means God's work will be done in our heart. That's our prayer. That's God's promise.